retiring is difficult, right? A lot of people feel like there's a pressure to go to retire, and there's a lot of myths around that. And one of the things that I thought we can walk through is that over the last 20 years of us walking through and doing this with people and helping people successfully retire, let's dig in a little bit to those myths that we talk about all the time with people.
Perfect.
And so, but look, I'd be remiss if we didn't start off with we should call them Karen jokes.
Yeah, I like it.
Karen
My famous jokes. All right, are you ready for today's?
Probably not, but let's see what you got.
All right. What goes oh oh oh? Santa walking backwards.
Nothing like a mid-year Christmas joke,
right? Christmas in July.
All right, that was tough. So when you go through to think about these myths, a lot of times I think myth number one that we hear a lot is about a number, some big magical number. You hear different things. You need 1.8, 1.5, some number.
Yep.
But that's not necessarily true.
I feel like back in the day, it used to be 1 million. Everyone thought if you have $1 million, you can go and retire. We all very much know that that's not the case nowadays.
My take is this myth has made people think that it's about a number. And the reality is that it's really about the outcomes that you want. And it's really about what sort of income you can produce off of it.
Absolutely.
Right? And we'll dig into some of these other myths inside of there. But I really think it all boils down to, you said something a second ago, we all know you can't retire with $1 million. I don't know that that's true. We talk to people all the time. And I say, yeah, you can retire at any age with any amount of money. It just depends on what your lifestyle is.
Exactly.
Right? If you have no debt, your house is paid for, you don't travel a lot, you don't necessarily want those finer things in life. You are very content with a simple life, doing simple things. You don't want to travel. You don't want to go and do things. You don't need as much money. And now, if you want retirement to be about experiences, about things with grandchildren, you maybe need more. So I think that this whole idea around a number it's a great marketing ploy. What's your number? You remember there was that commercial, people walking around with their big orange numbers. But it's really about what outcomes do you need, and what is our probabilities of success to reach those? And that's really the key. Once you determine those things, then you get inside of there. And it basically what it does is it frees you up from the benchmarks. It frees you up to live the life that you want to go through to enjoy.
Yep. All right, let's go on to misconception number 2. This one I feel like we talk about this all the time. People think that we just need 1 more year until I go to retire. And there's a lot of reasons people might think it's 1 more year, 2 more years, 3 more years. That can be anything from waiting until the market recovers, waiting until we get past this geopolitical tension that we have happening. We get past, figuring out something regarding healthcare. There's all these things that people have in their mind that just if we get past this event, then I'll retire at the end of this year or 2 years down the road.
Well, look, we've seen that, right? With clients who have significant end-of-year bonuses that get paid in March. Well, I just need to make it through this time so I can get paid. And then they go 6 months because they didn't let their employer know, so they need 6 more months. And then it's like, well, if I just work 6 more months, I'm going to get a little bit more. The cost of doing that, the reality is that if you go in and you do your planning in advance, and you have a high degree of confidence that walking into retirement, you have the income streams that you need, you have your assets set up, and you can live the life, or in other words, the outcomes that you want. It seems like I'm kind of hitting on that a lot. Then more's not going to change your life, right? And, it's a real problem if all of your financial planning is all determined on what the market is going to do. Because, look, let's just look at this year. Started off pretty good, then it went bad, then it felt like it was going to be really bad, then it went good, then it went bad, and then it kind of feels okay right here. Yep. But at any point inside of there, you may make that decision. I really think that what you have to do is to avoid that myth or that 1 more year myth is number one, determine what it is you're going to do to fill your time. If you have nothing to do in retirement, and you enjoy what you're doing, you should not feel like you have to go and continue to work. But if you're like, hey, I've done this is good, I'm going to fill my time doing X, Y, and Z, and this is what I'm going to do here, and I'm really excited, and it gives me a reason to get up, that one more year is really costing you experience, joy, life. And if you go through and you do your planning in advance and have your income streams and you've stress tested it so you understand what your probabilities of success are, more is not going to change that lifestyle.
Absolutely. I think that ties perfectly into the third and final misconception that people often have, and that's what we like to call the keeping up with the Joneses part of it. So feeling like everyone else around you that is about to retire or has retired has this certain lifestyle, and you need to accomplish that before you go and retire.
Well, this feeds back into one of our past podcasts, right? And that was I forget which number it was, but the point was people in their 70s and 80s, when asked what a regret was, is that they didn't do something sooner.
Yep, absolutely.
Right? Now, that may mean that they didn't save more sooner. That may mean that they didn't retire sooner. But in most cases, it means that they didn't pursue what they're really passionate about sooner, right? This nest egg, look, I think it's vitally important that we not understate how important proper prior planning is. Whoa, that was fast.
3 P's in a row. That. Good job.
Yeah. Actually, I think it's 7. Proper prior planning. Oh, I didn't do the prevents. The proper prior planning can take away the stress of whether or not you're making a bad decision.
Absolutely.
In fact, just this morning, I had a conversation with a client that was looking to buy a piece of property to build a second home. It was really good to go through and quickly do the calculations, confirm what I intuitively knew, and say to him, hey, we can't make a bad decision here. This will be okay. This is how we go and do it. And, you know, what was crazy is that you could really kind of hear, that's the reason why I called you. Thank you. That's what I was thinking, but I needed to make sure. So that proper planning to ensure that you feel comfortable about it, it takes away, it gives you, you have the confidence. It doesn't have to be complex. Oh, man, there's a lot of alliteration going on today.
You're doing well.
To be able to go inside there. So it really boils down to the way you, as opposed to focused on the nest egg, and maybe you have some thoughts here, is that how do you, the starting point, obviously the plan. The next point would be budget. What are some things that people need to think about?
Well, I think you're tying perfectly into the next part of this. So we've given 3 solid misconceptions about why people wait to retire or maybe don't retire when they want to. We've already kind of talked through some of these, but let's go through specifically the 5 things people can do so that they can actually retire when they want to and have the confidence like you've been saying. So the very first one I think is the one that you just hit on, is knowing what your income is and what you want it to be. And what I mean by that is when I say income, I really mean your lifestyle. Know what you want to live on in retirement and have an idea of that. So before you go and retire, spend 3 to 6 months really accurately looking at what are you spending, where is your money going, and come up with a budget. We often tell our clients, you know, we're not putting you on a budget, but we need to know what that budget is pretty accurately. That way we can create the proper plan and know what the assets are going to do. Yeah,
you know, it all feeds into the dynamic age approach, right?
Absolutely.
Which has to be adaptable. You have to have growth and you have to ensure that you have the outcomes, right? And how do you set that up? And once you have that number, the next step is determining what your guaranteed sources of income are.
Absolutely.
That's Social Security. Now, the thing that's key about Social Security is understanding when is the right time to collect Social Security. Most people get their advice as to when to collect Social Security from their next door neighbor, or in other words, or one of their peers, or a friend, or a family member. They're getting it from someone who may or may not be an expert in that, right? Because people say, oh, Social Security, I don't even want to count it. The reality is Social Security is meaningful. It can be over $1 million for a married couple in income streams. Understanding when to collect and what that amount is. You take what your budget is, subtract it from what you're going to get in guaranteed income sources, which also could be pensions. It could be annuities. It could be different things that are inside there. Most people don't have all three, right? Then you have your number.
You know, one interesting stat I'm going to throw in there on pensions. I typically think of nowadays, we don't often hear many companies that have pensions anymore. There's certain sectors that do, but on average, a lot of our clients don't have pensions from their employer. I read recently that as of 2024, only 15% of people have a pension from their employer nowadays.
Really?
Yeah.
And I bet you if you were to go to look at the number of people who actually take the pension, that from 15%, it's probably less than 10% of
I was going to say even probably 5.
I was going to say less than 10% of the 15% actually go to take the pension. Most people take a lump sum payment there.
Absolutely.
And you have to be real careful about that because, and that leads into step number 3, which is make sure you have safe reserves.
Yep.
You have to have money for those emergencies. That's that emergency fund. That is making sure that you have access to cash or capital when you need it, when something comes up.
Well, and that ties exactly like you said, back into our dynamic age approach. So having that number of years, a period of years where you have your cash set aside that is designed for living and not having to touch your assets that are the most exposed in the market, giving those assets the time to grow.
You know, and as you're going through and you go to look at step 4, that's vitally important, is stress testing it. A lot of people will go through and build a spreadsheet, and they end up with these very intricate spreadsheets. And what they end up doing is they say, what if the market returns 5%? What if the market returns 7%? What if the market returns 2%? There's a big fallacy in assuming that the markets are always going to go up some number. Over time, you can expect for the markets to go up and you can get a good conservative number. Let's just call it 8%. But that doesn't happen all the time.
Exactly.
You need to stress test it because the sequence of returns is that coupled with asset allocation is going to determine your success.
You know, sorry, not to cut you off. I'd say something that's super interesting about that with the development of AI and everything being made online for people to go in and do it themselves. Something I'm seeing a lot of is there's a lot of different providers now that offer to create a financial plan for people. And they're very usually using that term financial plan because what they're often doing is, like you just said, they're looking at the numbers and they're looking at a set return every year of markets going up by this amount. What is so inaccurate about that is the fact that they're not stress testing those portfolios. They're not using a sequence of return or a Monte Carlo analysis to look at what actual probabilities of success would be for someone in that situation. So it's so crucially important when planning for retirement to stress test the portfolio and use the right type of service. So what advisors typically offer, what we offer, is the ability to go in and use that Monte Carlo analysis and make sure we're on track with what actuality is going to be and what's realistic in the markets.
You know, and just imagine it's 2007, markets are at all-time highs, and you're like, man, I've got enough, I'm going to go and retire. And the S&P 500 drops over 50%.
How scary that must have been.
And you're withdrawing funds from there. If you don't have it set up the right way and you haven't stress tested it, you are going to make a big difference. I mean, it's going. If you haven't stress tested, it's going to increase your anxiety about being successful.
Absolutely.
And if you've set that income plan and you've set that up correctly, it's going to be scary. Let's be honest. When 08 and 09 happened, it's going to be scary. But you're going to have a lot more confidence in your ability to be successful.
Absolutely.
And get the outcomes that you want. And what we found is that a lot of times now, without regard to 08 and 09, we see a lot of people kind of considering this kind of transition phase. We just had a meeting with a client that was like, I'm retiring at the end of the month. And 5 days later, I'm consulting.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
And that transition phase is valid. How do you see how that helps people move to?
Yep. And so point number 5 being leading into this transition phase, I think this gives people a really good kind of test run into what retirement looks like. So scaling back work, whether that be part-time, consulting jobs, a side gig, something like that. I think it eases the anxiety people have of going from a full-time job and every 2 weeks paycheck to starting to scale back work, starting to maybe work a couple times a week to eventually that full-time retirement. It eases the emotional burden and the emotional anxiety around retirement by kind of taking this stair-stepped approach as you back off work and ease into retirement.
Yeah, and I think that you're exactly right. It just kind of makes it so that life, it's not this massive start stop start stop type of thing, and it lets you ease into it, and that really. And look, if you enjoy doing what you're doing, and now you can do it for 3 days a week, I'm a big proponent for people having things that keep them engaged, because I think that adds to longevity.
Well, we did a podcast a while back, and I forget which number it was, but we talked a lot about the emotional and the benefits that go along with continuing to work in retirement, whether that's part-time or a side gig or something, the emotional connection, the physical going and seeing people, getting out of your house and having that connection with another human being. There's a lot of benefits we talked about on that episode of why people continue working into retirement through part-time jobs, and this just feeds right into that.
That's exactly right. Well, listen, I hope that this has been valuable. I think a lot of people have questions. And if you need help in going through to figure out how do you create this income stream, we have a lot of resources at concenturewealth.com that you can go and check inside of our blogs and inside of some of our guides that will help walk you through or start giving you things to go through to think about. Hope you found a lot of value in this episode. And Karen, thank you. And we will see you next week.
See you next time.